So it's now our pleasure to have the last talk. It was the chronology which led you in this place. Well, I don't know if it's cherry on the cake, but Professor Henning Sievert will speak about subject touching Ottoman history. He's a professor of Islamology at Heidelberg University since 2018. He is a specialist of educational and political relations in 18th century or within 18th century Ottoman elite on Tripoli, Benghazi, around the beginning of the 20th century. And he will now speak about the traces of lost books. What did high-level bureaucrats read before 1840?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind of introduction and the wonderful organization. I hope you bear with me, even if it's the last talk, and even if I will not go into the same direction as all the others. There have been lectures about books, about textual traditions, about whole libraries. I'm not going to talk about any of this, but you will see. And there's also several centuries in between. That's the first third of the 19th century, so it's really far away from what was before. And as you see, we're going a few decades back as well. This is the steps we're going to take. I trust you have been reading everything right now. We'll come back to it. The first question is, why should we bother what these people knew or were educated in, the so-called high-level bureaucrats, just before the famous or infamous so-called reform period in the Near East, the Ottoman Empire, starting 1840, the so-called Tanzimat started, historiographically they are considered to be starting in 1839. So why is it important? Because just like in other regions of the world, the mid-19th century was a period of rebuilding or reinventing the empire in a modern sense. So, at the same point in time, emulating in a way what worked well, for example, in an idealized Paris or London. So what should we do to be as important, powerful, and modern and progressive as these people? This is the kind of mindset that came up, and the people who were the more or less carriers or the most important social group, perhaps, or political group that was in the center of this kind of reform process, at least seen from Constantinople, were exactly these bureaucrats. So it might be interesting to know what these people actually were educated in, knew. It would be nice to know what these people actually read, but I can't tell you what all of these people read, but at least I can ask what some of these people had on their bookshelves. Having a book doesn't mean you have read it, but that's something. What was considered important to have, to perhaps know. And a few years ago, an important colleague, Professor Henning, postulated that owning Western books from Western Europe, in French especially, was a marker of high rank among Ottoman bureaucrats. This would be one possibility to follow. So what kind of sources are we looking at? Especially close to probate inventories, the famous entries of inheritance and so on in Qadi court registers, the Sharia sigillary or sigillatum hakim. This is one possibility I didn't look at really, but I took a closer look at an important collection of mukhalafat, that is confiscation registers. When bureaucrats considered or having the status of servitor of the royal servitor of the emperor died, then it was possible, or perhaps if they fell from grace, it was possible to confiscate their belongings. This is what happened, which was more or less diligently inventoried in this kind of registers. So there are slightly over 1,000 registers in the 17th and until the 19th century. And it took quite some time to go through these registers, but only looking for books. There's, of course, a lot of material, everything these people owned, but I was only interested in books. And I tried to find out what kind of books they had. That was the idea, the question. And a few years ago, in fact 15 years ago, I published my first impressions considering the mid-18th century. This is what it was about. It is about, let's see how it works. Yes, this is the time frame, but these inventories, confiscated inventories, were mainly from the mid-18th century. 36 registers, slightly over 3,000 titles, I think, all of them belonging to various types of high-level bureaucrats. And this is how it looks like. There's more than one format of probate inventory, or rather confiscation inventory, and this is one of these, of the mid-18th century, more or less typical. So this was my first impression. Then I promised 15 years ago, the second part will come soon. And now I'm about to finalize the second part. As you might have already suspected, I've been mainly doing other things. This is not really my specialty, but I keep continuing it, and I have to stick to the same categories I utilized for the mid-18th century to compare what I could find for the early 19th century. Otherwise, it would be difficult to compare. Just first to come back to the mid-18th century, what turned out to be widespread are objects of piety or devotion. It's not necessarily books one reads from start to finish, but it's, of course, Quran copies and the Masnavi and prayer collections, hadith collections, things like that. On the one hand, which is very widespread, was very widespread. Also in the sense of having just 2 or 3 books. If there are only 2 or 3 books in the inventory, it will mostly be of this type. Another type for the more educated or literally interested type would be belles-lettres and history, which might be headed together under the general in the general category of adab, that is not madrasa content. These are various, as you see, various things we would not put into the same category. And this also belonged to a certain habitus of these bureaucrats, the adab habitus, which turned out to differentiate most of these people from most ulema. So another question, so this is a differentiation from 2 types of education or Bildung. One is rather the adab type with these things, the other is rather the ilm type of madrasa. But turning to the registers of the early 19th century, what can we find out? I can't claim I know everything, but I'm still continuing and hoping to build something slightly more substantial because this is a different viewpoint. It differs from studying manuscript traditions, of course. And it has, of course, many drawbacks. This is what I've come up with so far. Most of the confiscation inventories stem from the early years of the 19th century. Slightly less than 3,000 titles. I had to throw out a few. But it's more estates than the former sample. So this is just starting here. Of course, we start on the right, and this is the second part. These are the individual registers in form of a table. I won't go into too many observations. I'm still collecting this. But as far as I was able to identify these people, some 3 each, in fact, were connected either with political upheaval that was very dangerous for the dynasty and so on in 1887-88, and 3 others were involved in the upheaval and so on in Egypt in the early 19th century in the wake of Napoleon's invasion and so on. And then there are a few other individuals, such as the inspector of timber, who was responsible for supplying timber for the imperial arsenal, and another one of several treasurers who showed very wide-ranging interest. The timber inspector collected quite a few books, and locally he seems to have endowed several of these books to a local mosque or madrasa, while the second is quite interesting because he collected books on several widely ranging, different topics, and also a so-called, let's call it a translation of the gospel. It is mentioned this way. So what does this register look like? This is one possibility of one Khairullah Effendi of the 19th century, who was in fact a high-ranking member of the Emir, and at the same time a bureaucrat. So it straddles both categories. In fact, a former physician, by the way, or former surgeon rather. He owed a lot of madrasa material, and also especially law, of course, because he was a Qadi Askar, leading Qadi, but he also had at least one commentary of the Shafi'i tradition, and another one, this is why it's in brackets, owned a few commentaries of Maliki law, while Hanafi law was, of course, the official mazhab. So to go into it, structurally, in the beginning, there's an explanation who was this person, more or less, and where's this estate, and what was the situation. After the person died, it was immediately sealed, and then commission drew up a list of everything that was found in the lodgings. And in the same introductory part, there's also a reference to disputes, the inheritors claiming something, and so on. The individual items of the list are characterized very shortly, neatly characterized, and the same is done with books. There seems to have been a specialist in this inspection or commission who identified the books orally, and a scribe laid down this description. The reason I can claim this is that there are hearing mistakes. Like this is of course wrong Arabic, and it's also such a title I couldn't find, but you might know Athkar and Nawawi. Prayer collection or hadith, whatever, and so there are 2 mistakes in one phrase, but this is not untypical, it's just from hearing. And hearing through, well, via Turkish or probably Turkish tongue and ear. And the titles are a mixture of Turkish, Arabic, and Persian usually. So the next part is this one. Just for example, here we have the short titles without a description. Sometimes there's a very short description of a few words, and the value for which it was sold, or rather auctioned off, probably. Sometimes there's also the buyers listed, the person who bought it in the auction. By way of example, I won't say anything about the Mus'haf, the first. The second is Shifa al-Sharif, not to be confused with other Shifas like Ibn Sina's and so on, but Shifa al-Sharif is also a prayer, or it's about the rights the Prophet has in front of the believers and so on. And so-called Misbah al-Munir. What is this? If you keep on looking, you will find, well, the Sharif says this is the Shifa by Qadiyat. And if you continue this, you will find first that there's a slight mistake, but a not untypical mistake, even today, it's a typical mistake. This is a kind of commentary on this one, which is, well, this, this refers to the original work by Ghazali. This is Shafa effect. So we have, it belongs together because there are two layers of commentaries, which is not untypical. In this way, you have a very short title, just 2 words, including a mistake, which refers to a small tradition. And the reader is supposed to know what it is. This is another example. We'll go through it very quickly. This is a similar bureaucrat who is of special interest for us because he had several different topics and so on. And he had whole 8 volumes of so-called Franke Basmaressen, that is Frankish printed pictures or pictured printing. But there's no title. We just learned that he had it. Ferengi probably means Latin script. And the person who drew up the list didn't identify it. Perhaps he couldn't or he wouldn't identify what it is. The whole thing is from 1806. And these are a few examples, just by way of, so that you can see what it looks like. This is, by the way, it's another type of listing. Manazil Awalim, and so on. And this is a typical hearing mistake. The person is Abu Lays, the very famous Quran commentary, exegesis, but he's certainly not written this way. So you might know him. You might also identify what it is a Majmu'ah, some kind of collection without any details. We don't know what it is in it. And there's also often some titles I couldn't identify. Other books are just referred to as books. For example, Kitab Arabi, something like that, or Kitab Farsi rather, or Divan Farsi. We don't know what it is, but it's there. Or 50 divans. This might also be part of the list. So there are other examples. By way of example, 2 of these we can identify more or less. One is the work of Ashok Chalabi, a cosmography. This one I said already. Sehatname, there are 2 possibilities at least. Perhaps it's rather a tradition. And what is called Hakkes Marifetname has to be this one, a kind of encyclopedic work of the late 18th century. So this brings together centuries-old works and rather recent ones, the author of which died only a few years ago. If we want to find out what topics are frequent, we stand before the difficulty, how do we define topics? The categories might be our categories. It's really not easy to identify or to decide which category a book belongs to. It might be, for example, a literary collection of biographies of mystical sheikhs. So is it about mystics, is it about literature, or is it about biographies? What is it, for example? So many books might belong to more than one topic. By putting together this, I've included books who are considered sharh, commentary on one certain book, or considered tarjama, which might mean a translation. And there are 65 titles represented more than 5 times, 6 times or more often, of course. So these are the 65 most frequently occurring titles. And very, I just decided they have to fit into one category, such as, for example, the pious books with special regard for the prophet, or prophetic tradition. This is not so much piety as hadith, and so on. You can. It's possible to build some categories, but of course, this is not. They're not a given. I've decided. And rather, I've tried to build the categories onto categorizations of the time, which occur, for example, in 18th century library collections. There's more than one categorization, to be sure, but this is probably better than using modern categories. For example, if you say religious, almost everything can be religious, but people of that time wouldn't have made this kind of decision. It's a modern division of religious, not religious, or secular. And this is the same. I decided to categorize it with a view to the main usage, I suspect, or that came up in library catalogues of the 18th or early 19th century, before Hamidian catalogues of the late 19th century. And it continues this way. There are several categories, and putting it together, it looks like this. There's another XL diagram. Many categories, you can't see which one is really the most important. For this reason, I consolidated them. You can see merged topics. So just like that, you have 4 main categories, which might be too general. Just wait for a moment. These are the 65 most frequent titles. 868 book titles that are most often part of the collection. So starting on the right side again, this is what I found for the mid-18th century. And this is what I found for the early 19th century, 2-3 generations later. The main difference, don't pay too much attention to the colors, the main difference is that what I termed linguistics, that is dictionaries and grammar mainly, was not among the most frequent titles. But then it turned up more often, mainly dictionaries. Monolingual or bilingual dictionaries. While others are more or less constant, roughly. Coming back to this, you can subdivide it, of course, comparing it, these most frequent titles with the individual titles I could identify. As I said, I couldn't identify everything, but quite a lot. And these are not the most frequent titles, but the titles in general I could more or less identify and put into under one heading. So this is similar, but not the same as the most frequent ones. You can subdivide it, of course, it's less clear, but what's most important is that this linguistics part is stable. It is in both categories the same, which is quite, I'm not sure what to do with this, but it's not only more often, does not only occur more often in under the most frequent part, but also in the less frequent parts. These titles mostly occur only once or perhaps twice. So in the end, one can ask what changes were there between the mid-18th and early 19th century. What is most obvious is that this kind of linguistic reference works seems to occur more often. While I'm not sure whether adab is less frequent, but it's certain that this standardization is rather continuing in the madrasa canon, while adab titles are not necessarily found more than 5 times. Perhaps only 1 or 2 is more diversified. That might be a possibility. And one other thing I would be glad to hear your suggestions about is this term philology, especially commentaries, sharh commentaries on adab works. It seems to become more widespread. This is also among the single or perhaps 2 or 3 times occurring titles. And so there's a sharh commentary on Hafiz or things like that. That's which is it just caught my eye. So you might be interested in translations. I will not go into that too much. These are the most frequent titles called tarjama. They are not necessarily translations, but let's call it translations for the moment. These are usually translations from Arabic or Turkish or Persian into Turkish. And compared with the mid-18th century, it's more or less the same. It's not very different. There are no translations from Western languages mentioned under this caption. And what about prints, usually called basma or matbua, that's the same, printed books? They seem to be less frequent than in the mid-18th century. This is interesting. It doesn't mean, I have only the titles, I don't have the books, so I can't really say it is all printed books, but I can say this is the titles where basma or matbua is mentioned. That's of course important. It includes also these Frankish things, and also some other printed books. There's no French or Latin book mentioned by title, not one. Or perhaps I haven't recognized it as possible. So this comes down to my preliminary findings for the moment. It's just the same as I just tried to explain, but perhaps it gives you some food for thought. Thank you.